The clash that the Royal Navy had been preparing itself for since 1909 had finished. Battles at sea are like thunderstorms, sudden, terrific, and soon over. Jutland began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the battleship action was practically over by 9. For the first time since William IV had been present at the Siege of Gibraltar, a future King of England had taken part in a major naval action, and he was now heading back for the boring safety of Scapa Flow. It would take several days before all the ships that had survived the battle made it back to port. HMS Spitfire limped along at 6 knots, but was able to get back to the Tyne in 36 hours. She brought with her a remarkable battle trophy, 20 feet of planking from the Nassau. Seydlitz reached harbour with an 8-degree list. They had tried towing her, but the cables broke. She ran aground on the Weser River, but sandbanks. By the time that she got to the harbour, that she had taken on 5,300 tons of water. It wouldn't be until the 13th that they'd pumped enough of it out to even get her into a dry dock to start on her repairs. In the Admiralty, Admiral Fisher had been waiting for the news. He had spent 30 years preparing for this day. Admiral Jellicoe had been Fisher's choice for wielding the fleet that he had created. In his official report, he blamed the battlecruiser's poor performance on their lack of armour. We know now that this was not the reason why they kept blowing up. The real reason was the British Cavalier attitude towards flash fires. The Germans had an advantage here in that they could learn from their earlier loss at the Battle of Dogger Bank. During that battle, a 13.5-inch shell had penetrated Seydlitz's aft turret. Powder in the turret caught fire and flashed below. It killed everybody in the 2 aft turrets and sent flames 200 feet above the ship. Only flooding of the magazines had saved the ship. After this, the German warships were provided with anti-flash protection for the hatches between handling rooms and magazines. The British had removed the flash-tight interlocks on almost all of Beatty's ships. Because of this, Queen Mary and Indefatigable had blown up, while all the German ships, even Lutzow, had been able to steam away after the battle. The performance of Beatty's battle cruisers at Jutland doomed the proposed Courageous, Glorious and Furious. Fisher had wanted to go even further in his quest for more speed and endurance. They were almost totally unprotected, and that now looked ridiculous. HMS Lion had escaped sharing the same fate of her sisters, but not by much. This was in part because of Major Harvey, but it was also because of Warrant Officer Gunner Alexander Grant. He had brought with him powder handling practices from Jellicoe's Grand Fleet, in direct opposition to both Chatfield and Beatty. Beatty would have had flash-tight interlocks quietly replaced in all of the surviving battle cruisers. Jellicoe had worried that the flash doors were being compromised because of the emphasis on gunnery speed. In 1915, he had even told Beatty that the gunnery speed was being taken to excess, but the battle cruisers were all about speed. They were designed to overhaul their opponents and outrange them to stay out of enemy fire. They were not supposed to get into slugging matches. As Admiral Fisher had said, speed was to be their armour. The Germans had a different design philosophy. Admiral Alfred Tirpitz believed that the supreme quality of a ship was that it should remain afloat. On the German battlecruisers, armour was to be their armour. De Flinger had as much armour as the flagship of the Grand Fleet, HMS Iron Duke. Even if their armour was penetrating, their hulls were subdivided into an enormous number of small compartments. The German battlecruisers were closer to a fast dreadnought of limited range. The only vessel the British had that could counter them were the dreadnoughts of the Queen Elizabeth class. German gunnery was also better. HMS Lion had been fitted with tripod mast and direct firing control after Dogger Bank, but the gunnery of BT's 6 battlecruisers was never more than mediocre. The same could not be said for the Germans. They could get on their target and start hitting in 2 or 3 minutes in almost every case. By the end of the battle, the first aid distribution station of HMS Tiger was so packed with wounded and dying men that when new cases were brought in, they had difficulty avoiding stepping on the others. Even when the British shells did land, they didn't do much damage. Hipper himself stated that the fire of British battlecruisers resulted in no serious damage to his own battlecruisers. In August 1916, Beatty gave a lunch party on board HMS Lion. Among his guests was a Swedish naval officer who had recently been attached to the Swedish embassy in Berlin. The Swede told Beatty's captain that the German naval officers considered British shells laughable. Count Felix von Luckner had sent a sailor out from his turret to gather souvenirs after the battle. He returned shouting that the British had been shooting cauliflowers at them. As the Germans were slipping away into the night, Beatty came down into the chart house. He sat down on the settee and closed his eyes, unable to hide his disappointment at the results of the battle. He kept repeating, "There is something wrong with our ships." Then he opened his eyes and added, "And there is something wrong with our system." Then he fell asleep. The propaganda battle began almost as soon as the real one ended. From a German perspective, the battle had been an obvious victory. They had watched British ships blowing up before their eyes. After finishing his champagne, Scheer assembled his officers and asked for their reports. He then telegraphed them to the naval station at Berlin. By early morning, an official communique was published announcing a German victory while the British ships were still at sea. Margot Asquith complained about the slow British response. Ominous rumours started spreading across Britain. Some originated in Rosyth dockyard, which was preparing to receive a lot of damaged ships. Jellicoe was sent the text of the German report by radio. The Admiralty asked him for a response, but his mind was still on the battle and not on public relations. The Austrian naval attaché reported to Vienna that the German fleet was intoxicated with victory. Scheer received a written note of congratulations from the Kaiser. There were celebrations throughout Germany, with schoolchildren given a holiday just so they could join in. By the 2nd of June, the German propaganda machine was operating at full tilt. The Kaiser Wilhelm visited the dockyards and decorated sailors with the Iron Cross, surrounded by cheering crowds. Reuters based their own reporting entirely on what the Germans wanted to appear because Jellicoe and Beatty were still at sea. Their Amsterdam bureau picked up the official communique in Berlin and then cabled it to their London bureau and on to America. When the British sailors finally got to port, there was no way that the Admiralty could conceal things any longer. 6,000 uncensored messages flashed out across telegraph lines as sailors told their loved ones that they were safe. The cat was out of the bag and the German communique had to be published in Britain. Jutland was a bad blow for British prestige. The Royal Navy had come off worse in terms of ships and lives, including 3 admirals, but just looking at the numbers does not tell you a complete story. As far as Jellicoe was concerned, annihilating the enemy was a nice to have. It was not the primary objective. The Grand Fleet was still held command of the seas and continued its long-distance blockade, which would eventually starve Germany to its knees. Dockyard workers heard the news from Reuters' report and jeered at sailors in the streets. Some people even spat at them. The public had expected all they needed was the Grand Fleet to meet the Germans and they would be blown out of the water. The result of the battle was quite a shock, and the Navy came in for a lot of criticism in the press. The German papers, however, spoke not just of a victory, but of the annihilation of the Royal Navy. Newspapers on both sides counted the losses and scored them like a cricket match. To try and turn the situation around, Balfour gave his predecessor, Winston Churchill, access to the confidential reports and dispatches so that he could use his genius as a wordsmith to put a better spin on the situation. On December the 5th, Jellicoe took up his new role at the Admiralty as the First Sea Lord to help with the pressing problem of the submarine threat. He was succeeded by Beatty. This would not have been his first choice, but now he had other problems to deal with. As First Sea Lord, he had to find an answer to the problem of the submarine raids on Britain's supply lines. He did not want to see Britain in the same position as Germany, where the blockade was hitting the population hard. Both Jellicoe and Beatty would be promoted to Admiral of the Fleet after the war. While Beatty was elevated to an earldom and given a grant of £100,000 for his service, Jellicoe only received the title of Viscount and £50,000, which shows just how much better Beatty was at his PR campaign. The first accounts from his perspective were published in 1920. He even had the official report altered to make the battle cruisers part of the action look better. The author of that report produced his own uncensored version in 1927, which did not pull any punches. But beyond the communications headlines, who really did win the Battle of Jutland? It was certainly a PR victory for Beatty. Even though his ships had been blowing up, he was proclaimed another Nelson. his reputation would not last. In subsequent years, Franz von Hipper was the only one of the 4 senior admirals at Jutland to escape criticism. It's an indisputable fact that in the first phase of the battle, the British squadron, although superior in numbers and gunpowder, got its arse handed to it. If you look at this action alone, it would have been one of the worst defeats in the history of the Royal Navy. Beatty was only saved by the intervention of Admiral Evan Thomas. Beatty even wrote to Evan Thomas to thank him for his support, although his gratitude did not last long enough to get into Beatty's official dispatches. Here, he would end up attempting to deflect some of the blame of his performance onto Evan Thomas. Beatty wasn't the only one engaged in a cover-up. The extensive damage inflicted on the High Seas Fleet was also hidden. Once the public cock-crowing had calmed down, the truth about the damage, particularly on Lutzow, started to leak out. The battle had left Scheer with only 1 battlecruiser out of 5 in good fighting order. Because the German fleet was so much smaller than the Royal Navy, it would be much more difficult for them to absorb this damage. All Jellicoe needed to do was pick up fuel and the Grand Fleet was ready to go back out to sea. The High Seas Fleet would not be ready for sea until mid-August. When Warspite came into dock at Rosyth, Queen Elizabeth came out. When Malaya went into the floating dock at Invergordon, Emperor of India came out. Britain's superiority at sea remained as overwhelming as ever, and the Germans had not got any closer to their aim of supplanting Great Britain as the leading naval power of Europe. But even worse than the loss of ships was the loss of their crews. The Royal Navy had gone into this war with a fleet 60% larger than that of Germany. It had 146,000 men, backed up by a large reserve. But even by the standards of World War I, the loss of 8,500 men in a single day's battle was a terrible blow to both fleets. It was not just the physical wounds that the men would have to recover from. One sailor from HMS Malaya was taken to the hospital at Queensferry, but his mind was still trapped in his gun turret. He kept shouting at the nurses to pass him shrapnel until the woman started feeding him jelly to shut him up. This turned out to be Lady Jellicoe herself. When HMS Dublin found one of the survivors of HMS Tipperary clinging to a tea-box, they had to drop down Jacob's ladder to get him to climb on board. But he was already exhausted from the cold, and they sent down a man with a line so that he could be hauled on board. HMS Warrior had about 100 men killed or wounded when Engadine took her in tow. After the wounded were transferred to the Engadine, her crew gave her 3 cheers as she disappeared beneath the waves. The following morning, there was a more solemn ceremony, as 2 of the men who had not lasted the night were returned to their ship. Bodies in the uniforms of both nations floated in life preservers. Many of the men had died not from wounds or drowning, but from exposure. The captain of HMS Ardent had to watch many of his men die during the night, one by one, as exposure took them. They seemed to lie back and go to sleep, never to wake again. They drifted with the currents until they washed up in Norway. There were only 2 people from Britain able to attend the service when they were buried, but the Norwegians brought them flowers and laid them to rest as if they were their own. The destroyer HMS Broke struggled back to the Tyne 2.5 days after the battle had ended. They had had to bury 48 of their messmates at sea, most with bodies that were shattered beyond recognition. When it came to bury the dead of HMS Lion, Beatty was fighting back tears. When he could not continue, he handed the prayer book to Chatsfield, who continued the service. The grandest funeral was given to the lowest ranked victim of the battle. Boy Seaman John Travers Cornwall was buried with full naval honours. His coffin was drawn by a gun carriage and escorted by the band of the Royal Naval Division. Despite mortal wounds, he had stood at his post the whole battle before seeking help. He had even made it to shore, where he had been transferred to hospital and a telegraph sent to his mother asking her to come quickly. His last words had been to one of the nurses. He wanted them to tell his mother that he knew that she was coming. She arrived only a few hours too late. But I'd like to leave the last word on this battle to one of the sailors from poor battered Wiesbaden, Johann Kienau, better known as Gork Fock. He was a writer and a poet as well as a sailor. When his body was washed up in Sweden, his last poem was found sealed in a box in his pocket. It was titled Last Wish. If I die on the proud sea, grant Gorge Fock a sailor's grave. Do not take me to a churchyard, sink me deep into the sea. Sailmakers, sew me in. Helmsman, a Bible verse. Boy, take off your cap. Then, smartly overboard. Thank you for listening this long.